Billionaire CEO dared his maid to translate a contract to humiliate her. The maid did. He was speechless. The 42nd floor conference room of Aldridge Capital had a view of Lake Michigan that most people only saw in postcards. It also had 8 German investors seated around a long glass table, jet-lagged and waiting, and Richard Aldridge, CEO, 56 years old, a man whose name sat on 3 different buildings in downtown Chicago, standing at the head of it with a $200 million manufacturing contract in front of him. 42 pages, entirely in German. His translator had called 20 minutes ago. Car accident on the Kennedy. Not hurt, just gone, along with any chance of this meeting proceeding the way Richard had planned it. The investors were starting to exchange glances. That was when the door opened. Vanessa Price, 31 years old, 2 years on staff at Aldridge Capital, cleaning offices before dawn, and now, this morning, pushed into conference room duty because the regular coffee service was short-staffed. She wheeled in a small cart. Silver carafe, china cups, the kind of quiet, practiced efficiency of someone who had learned to move through rooms like this without being noticed. She began pouring coffee. Richard watched her for a moment, and something. Boredom, maybe, or the particular cruelty of a man embarrassed in front of people he wanted to impress, moved behind his eyes. Actually, he said loud enough for the table, "Hold on." The room looked up. Richard gestured at Vanessa with 2 fingers, the same gesture he might use to summon a waiter. "You," he said, "come here."
You, come here. Let's see if the help can do any better.
Here. Vanessa set the carafe down, walked toward him. Richard picked up page 1 of the contract and held it out to her, not to help her, to make a point. "My translator's stuck in traffic," he said, smiling now at the investors, performing for them. "Let's see if the help can do any better." A ripple of uncomfortable laughter moved around the table. One investor did not laugh. Vanessa looked at the page in Richard's hand, then at him. Then she set down her serving tray, took the document, and began to read. And what nobody in that room knew, not Richard, not the investors, not the 8 powerful men waiting to see her fail, was that Vanessa Price had graduated summa cum laude in translation studies 5 years ago. She had been waiting 2 years for someone to finally ask. "Where are you watching from tonight? I would like to connect with you better." Take a moment to like and click the subscribed button, because what Vanessa is about to do with that contract is going to make this billionaire wish he had never opened his mouth in front of his own investors. To understand what happened in that conference room on the 42nd floor of Aldridge Tower, you need to understand 2 things. Who Richard Aldridge was, and who Vanessa Price really was, beneath the gray housekeeping uniform that nobody in that building had ever bothered to look past. Aldridge Capital occupied the top 6 floors of a glass tower on South Wacker Drive, overlooking the bend of the Chicago River, where it caught the morning light and turned, briefly, the color of brass. The company had been built by Richard's father in the 1970s. Industrial manufacturing, steel contracts, the unglamorous machinery of American infrastructure. And Richard had spent the last 22 years transforming it into something considerably larger. Private equity arms, international partnerships, a name that opened doors in Frankfurt and Tokyo and São Paulo as easily as it opened them in Chicago. Richard Aldridge was, by every external measure, a success. He was also, by the quieter measure that mattered considerably more, and that nobody put on a business card, a man who had stopped seeing most of the people around him as people sometime around his 40th birthday. It hadn't happened all at once. It rarely does. It happened in increments. The way a person's vision narrows gradually, almost without their noticing, until one day they look up and realize the world has shrunk to the size of the people who can be useful to them. His assistants were extensions of his schedule. His drivers were extensions of his commute. The people who cleaned his offices, served his coffee, and maintained the machinery of his daily life had become in his mind a category rather than a collection of individuals. Present the way furniture was present, functional the way appliances were functional, and about as interesting to him as either. He was not, by his own accounting, a cruel man. He simply did not think about the people in that category often enough to know whether he was being cruel to them or not. Vanessa Price had grown up on the south side of Chicago, in a neighborhood where ambition was common and opportunity was not, which was, she had come to understand over the years, a very specific kind of cruelty all its own. Her mother worked as a home health aide. Her father had been a high school custodian for 31 years, the kind of man who knew every student's name in a building of 2,000 kids and made it his business to notice when one of them needed something nobody else had noticed they needed. Vanessa had inherited that from him. The noticing. She had been good at languages from the time she was small, not in the casual, occasional way that some children show an aptitude and then let it fade, but in the deep, hungry way of a kid who had found the one subject that made the inside of her head feel like it had more room in it than she'd previously realized. German came first, a free after-school program in 8th grade, taught by a retired teacher named Mrs. Holloway, who had lived in Munich for a decade and never quite left it behind. Vanessa had been the only student who stayed after the program ended most days, asking questions, borrowing books, building something in her mind that felt less like a class and more like a second home she was slowly furnishing. By high school, she had added French. By her sophomore year of college, on a partial scholarship to the University of Illinois at Chicago, that she had supplemented with 2 part-time jobs and a level of exhaustion she rarely spoke about, she had added conversational Mandarin and begun the deep, technical study of translation theory that would become her major. She graduated summa cum laude. Translation studies with a concentration in German and business communication. She had a job lined up before graduation, a junior position at a translation firm downtown, modest salary, real potential, the first rung of a ladder she had spent 4 years building toward with a discipline that few people in her life had fully understood the cost of. Then her mother had a stroke. It was sudden, it was severe, and it required, in the months that followed, a level of care that the family's resources could not fully cover, and a level of Vanessa's time that the translation firm, entry-level, unsympathetic, run by people who had never had to choose between a career and a parent, was unwilling to accommodate. She left the job before she had fully started it. She took what was available, what was flexible, what allowed her to be home by 3 some days and stay overnight others when her mother's condition required it. Housekeeping work paid steadily, asked few questions, and didn't care if she left mid-shift on the days her mother needed her. Aldridge Capital, through a cleaning contractor, had been her placement for the past 2 years, 3 days cleaning the executive floors before the building filled, and now, increasingly, asked to help with conference room service when the regular staff was short. It was not the life she had built 4 years of relentless work to walk into, but it was the life that let her be present for her mother, who was, slowly, 2 years later, recovering. And Vanessa had never once regretted the choice, even on the days when it asked more of her than she had expected to give. What she had not done, in 2 years at Aldridge Capital, was tell anyone there what she knew. What she had studied. What sat, fluent and ready, in the part of her mind that the gray uniform and the cleaning cart had never once required her to access. Nobody had asked. And there is a particular kind of quiet that settles over a person who has stopped expecting to be asked. Not bitterness, not exactly, but a careful, practiced invisibility that becomes, over time, almost comfortable. Vanessa had been wearing that quiet for 2 years. This morning, in a conference room full of German investors and a CEO reaching for a cheap laugh, that quiet was about to end. Vanessa held the page in both hands. 42 pages of dense German legal language sat on the glass table behind her. Clause structures, conditional terms, the particular bureaucratic density of contract German that even fluent speakers found exhausting on a good day. She had read enough in the first 3 seconds to know exactly what kind of document this was. She had also read enough in those same 3 seconds to know exactly what Richard Aldridge was doing. This was not a request for help. This was a performance, and she had been cast, without her consent, in the role of the punchline. "Take your time," Richard said, leaning back against the head of the table with the easy posture of a man enjoying himself. No pressure. A small laugh moved around the table. Not from everyone. The investor closest to Richard's right, an older man with silver hair and steady gray eyes, did not laugh. He watched Vanessa with the particular attentiveness of someone who had not yet decided what he was watching. His name, though nobody had told Vanessa yet, was Klaus Brenner, founder and chairman of Brenner Industrial Group, the company on the other side of this negotiation. He had flown in from Stuttgart 11 hours ago, and he had the look of a man who had sat through a great many performances in boardrooms over 4 decades and had developed, as a result, very little patience for them. Vanessa looked down at the page. She read it once, silently, the way she had trained herself to do, full comprehension before a single word was spoken aloud, because translation done in real time without that step was how meaning got lost, and meaning, in a document like this, was the entire point. Then she looked up. "This is the preamble," she said. "It establishes the parties, Aldridge Capital and Brenner Industrial Group, and the general intent of the agreement, which is a joint manufacturing partnership for precision component production, with shared intellectual property rights under terms specified in Section 4. The room went quiet. Richard blinked. "That's..." He stopped, recalibrated. "That's just the opening. Anyone could guess that part." "Would you like me to continue?" Vanessa asked. There was something in her voice that had not been there 30 seconds ago. Not defiance, exactly. Something quieter and more dangerous than defiance. Certainty. Richard's jaw tightened slightly. He had expected... What, exactly? He had not thought it through. He had reached for a cheap laugh the way men like him reach for cheap laughs when they feel a room slipping slightly out of their control. And he had assumed, without examining the assumption, that the woman in the gray uniform would stumble through a few mangled phrases, the investors would laugh kindly, and the moment would pass with Richard restored to his rightful position as the most capable person in the room. That was not what was happening. "Sure," he said, recovering his smile. "Go ahead." Vanessa turned to page 2. She read for a moment. Her eyes moved with the particular speed of someone who was not translating word by word but absorbing structure, meaning, intent, the deeper fluency that 4 years of formal study and a lifetime of hunger for language had built into something closer to instinct than skill. Section 2, she said. Capital contributions. Aldridge Capital commits $80 million in initial funding, dispersed in 3 tranches tied to manufacturing milestones. Brenner Industrial Group contributes the existing facility in Stuttgart, valued at... She paused, scanning the figure, 42 million euros, along with existing patents listed in Appendix C. She looked up. Should I continue to Section 3? Klaus Brenner had stopped looking at the contract entirely. He was looking at Vanessa. Richard's assistant, standing near the window, had gone very still. The particular stillness of someone who sensed correctly that the temperature of the room had shifted and was trying to determine which direction it was moving. "This is a trick," Richard said, attempting lightness that didn't quite land. "You memorized this. Somebody fed you this." "Nobody fed me anything, Mr. Aldridge," Vanessa said. "I'm reading the document in front of me, in German, the language it's written in." "Prove it," Richard said. "Translate something I pick, not the order you've apparently rehearsed." He grabbed the stack of pages, flipped through them with the agitated speed of a man no longer enjoying his own performance, and stopped somewhere past the midpoint. He thrust the page at her. "Section 11, he said. "Go." Vanessa took it, read it, and something moved behind her eyes that had not been there during the preamble or the capital contributions. Something sharper. "Section 11, she said slowly, covers dispute resolution and arbitration jurisdiction." She read further. "It specifies that any disputes arising from this agreement will be resolved under German arbitration law in Frankfurt, with Brenner Industrial Group retaining the right to select 2 of the 3 arbitrators." She looked up. "That's not standard," she said. "In a partnership of this size, arbitrator selection is typically split evenly, or determined by a neutral third party. This clause gives Brenner Industrial Group structural control over any dispute resolution process before a single dispute has even occurred." The room had gone completely silent. Klaus Brenner's expression had not changed, but something in the stillness of it had sharpened. Richard stared at her. "That's not..." He stopped, looked down at the page in his own copy, fumbling to find Section 11, reading it for what was, judging by his expression, the first time he had actually read it carefully at all. "That can't be right. I'd encourage you to have your legal team confirm it," Vanessa said evenly. "But I'm confident in the translation." Richard looked up at her. The performance, the easy smile, the casual cruelty, the small joke at the help's expense, had completely evaporated from his face, replaced by something considerably less comfortable. The dawning, specific horror of a man realizing he was about to sign a $200 million contract he had not actually fully understood, and that the only person in the room who had caught the problem was the woman he had just publicly humiliated for sport. "Mr. Brenner," Richard said, turning toward the older man, his voice noticeably tighter than it had been 10 minutes ago. "I'm sure there's an explanation for." "There is an explanation," Klaus Brenner said. He had not raised his voice. He didn't need to. "My legal team drafted that clause 8 months ago," he said. "It has been in every version of this contract since. I assumed, Mr. Aldridge, that your team had reviewed it as thoroughly as mine had." He let that sit. "I see now that I assumed incorrectly." Richard's face had gone the particular shade of pale that comes from a man watching, in real time, the careful architecture of a deal he had spent 8 months building begin to show cracks he hadn't known were there. He looked at Vanessa, still standing, still holding the page, still wearing the gray housekeeping uniform that he had looked straight through for 2 years without once wondering what was underneath it. "Who are you?" he said. It was not a question delivered with curiosity. It was a question delivered with the particular desperation of a man who has just discovered that the floor beneath him is not where he thought it was. "Who are you?" The question hung in the conference room with the particular weight of a man who already suspected the answer would not make him feel better. Vanessa set the page down on the glass table, carefully, the way she handled everything, with a precision that had nothing to do with the gray uniform she was wearing and everything to do with the 4 years of training underneath it. "My name is Vanessa Price," she said. "I clean this floor 3 mornings a week. This morning your coffee service was short-staffed, so I was asked to help." She paused. "That's who I am to Aldridge Capital," she said. "It is not the whole of who I am, but it's apparently the only part anyone here has ever asked about." The room was completely silent. Richard opened his mouth, found nothing useful to put in it, closed it again. Klaus Brenner leaned forward slightly in his chair. "Miss Price," he said, and his English carried the careful precision of a man who had learned it as a third language and respected it accordingly. "Where did you study German?" "University of Illinois at Chicago," Vanessa said. "Translation studies. I graduated summa cum laude with a concentration in German and business communication. 5 years ago," she added when no one spoke, "I had a position lined up at a translation firm downtown. My mother had a stroke 2 weeks before I was supposed to start. I needed flexible work that let me be present for her care. Housekeeping was what was available." She said it simply, without self-pity, without performance, without the particular bitterness that the situation might have justified. Just the facts. The facts, delivered in the same clear, unhurried voice she had used to translate Section 11 and catch a clause that had been sitting in this contract, unexamined for 8 months. Klaus Brenner sat back in his chair. He looked, for a long moment, not at Vanessa but at Richard, and something in his expression had shifted from the polite, jet-lagged patience he had carried into the room 2 hours ago into something considerably more pointed. "Mr. Aldridge," he said, "how long has Miss Price worked in this building?" 2 years, Richard said. The number came out smaller than he intended. 2 years, Brenner repeated. "And in 2 years, no one on your team identified that one of your own staff held a translation degree relevant to your international business." "I?" Richard started. "I am not asking to embarrass you further," Brenner said, though the statement did not entirely land as comforting. "I am asking because it tells me something important about how this company operates, about what it notices, about what it doesn't." He turned to look at Vanessa again, and about what it has apparently been sitting on without realizing it. The other investors at the table had gone very quiet, watching this exchange with the careful attention of people recalibrating their understanding of the room in real time. One of them, A younger man, mid-30s, who had been introduced earlier as Brenner's chief counsel, leaned toward Klaus and said something low in German. Vanessa caught it without meaning to. A reflex, the way fluency works once it's deep enough. You stop choosing to understand and simply do. Hat den Vertrag offensichtlich nie selbst gelesen. The counsel murmured. He clearly never read the contract himself. Vanessa kept her expression neutral. But something in her had settled in that moment into a kind of quiet vindication that she had not expected to feel and was not entirely sure, yet, what to do with. Richard, for his part, was no longer performing for anyone. The smile was gone. The easy posture against the head of the table was gone. He stood very straight now, the particular straightness of a man trying to hold himself together, while the foundation under him continued, methodically, to crumble. "Miss Price," he said. His voice had changed completely. No longer the careless, performative tone he had used 20 minutes ago, but something smaller and more careful. "Would you be willing to continue reviewing the rest of the contract with us, now?" Vanessa looked at him. She thought briefly about 2 years of gray uniforms. 2 years of being handed a duster instead of a conversation. 2 years of moving through executive floors as something closer to furniture than a colleague. Present, functional, unremarkable, the way Richard had needed her to be in order to never have to think about her at all. She thought about her mother, slowly recovering at home, 3 miles south of this building, in a neighborhood that men like Richard Aldridge had never once had reason to drive through. She thought about the degree on her wall, summa cum laude, framed, hung not in a corner office but in a small apartment where it had waited 5 years for a moment exactly like this one. "I'll continue," she said. "But I have terms." The room shifted. Richard blinked. "Terms?" "You asked me to translate this contract in front of your investors to make a point," Vanessa said. "I'm going to finish that translation, properly, section by section. And when I'm done, we're going to have a different conversation about what this company has had on its cleaning staff for 2 years without bothering to find out." She let that settle. "That conversation happens today," she said. "Not next week. Not when it's convenient. Today." Richard looked at her. Then at Klaus Brenner, who was watching this exchange with an expression that had moved, somewhere in the last 60 seconds, from polite interest into something that looked very much like respect. "Agreed," Richard said quietly. Vanessa picked up page 3. She worked through the contract methodically over the next 40 minutes, clause by clause, section by section, catching 2 more inconsistencies along the way that Richard's legal team had either missed entirely or hoped, optimistically, that no one would notice. A misaligned currency conversion in Section 17 that would have cost Aldridge Capital an estimated $600,000 over the life of the agreement. A liability clause in Section 23 that exposed the company to risk well beyond what Richard's team had represented to the board. Klaus Brenner's chief counsel took notes throughout, occasionally murmuring confirmation in German that Vanessa caught and, when relevant, relayed without being asked. By the time she reached the final page, the energy in the room had transformed completely. This was no longer a conference room where a CEO was performing cruelty for an audience. This was a room where a woman who had been invisible for 2 years was, methodically and without raising her voice once, demonstrating exactly how much that invisibility had cost the company that had failed to see her. Richard sat down at the head of the table. Not with authority, with the particular, deflated posture of a man who had walked into this meeting certain of his own competence and was leaving it considerably less certain of almost everything. He looked at Vanessa, finishing the final clause, setting the last page down with the same careful precision she had brought to the first one, and something in his expression had changed completely from the man who had snapped his fingers at her 90 minutes ago. It looked, underneath the exhaustion and the embarrassment, almost like recognition, the kind that comes far too late, but comes sometimes anyway. She just saved this company hundreds of thousands of dollars and exposed a clause that could have cost millions more, and she did it in the same uniform he handed her a duster in 2 hours ago. Share this right now, because what Richard Aldridge does next is going to determine whether he learned anything at all today. or whether 2 years of looking through her was about to become the biggest mistake of his career. The conference room had emptied of its performance entirely. What remained, in the quiet after Vanessa set down the final page, was something far more honest than anything that had happened in the first 20 minutes of the meeting. A room full of powerful people confronting in real time exactly how close they had come to a costly mistake, and exactly who had stopped it. Klaus Brenner was the first to speak. "Miss Price," he said, "I would like to ask you something directly, if you'll permit it." "Of course," Vanessa said. "In your professional opinion," he said, "setting aside the corrections you identified, is this a fair contract between my company and Mr. Aldridge's?" The question landed with unexpected weight. Brenner was not asking her to flatter him. He was asking the only person in the room who had read every word of the document in its original language with full comprehension for an honest assessment that neither side's lawyers had apparently provided. Vanessa considered it for a moment. "With the corrections," she said, "yes. The structural issue in Section 11 needs to be renegotiated. Arbitrator selection should be balanced, not weighted toward either party. The currency conversion error in 17 needs to be fixed regardless of which direction it benefits. But the core partnership terms, the capital structure, the IP sharing framework, the manufacturing milestones, those are sound. Both companies built something reasonable here. It just wasn't reviewed carefully enough before it reached this table." Brenner nodded slowly. "That," he said, "is the most useful thing anyone has said to me in this building today." He turned to Richard. "Mr. Aldridge," he said, "I came to Chicago prepared to sign this agreement this afternoon. I am no longer prepared to do that, not because the partnership lacks merit, but because I no longer trust that your team reviewed it with the diligence a $200 million agreement requires." Richard's face tightened. "Klaus, I assure you." "I would like to reschedule," Brenner continued, unbothered by the interruption. "2 weeks. Time for your legal team to revisit sections 11, 17, and 23 with the corrections Miss Price identified. And," he paused deliberately, "I would like Miss Price present for that meeting, as a paid consultant, reviewing the final language on both sides." The room went very still. Richard looked at Vanessa, then back at Brenner. "That's not typically how we structure these reviews," he said carefully. "No," Brenner agreed. "It's not how Brenner Industrial structures them either, typically." He looked at Vanessa with something that, on his usually composed face, looked very close to admiration. "But I have been in business for 40 years, Mr. Aldridge, and I have learned that competence does not always arrive wearing the uniform you expect it to wear. When I find it, I do not let it walk back out the door because it makes for an unconventional org chart." He extended a hand toward Vanessa. "Will you accept the consulting role, Miss Price?" Vanessa looked at his hand, then at Richard, standing at the head of the table he had occupied with such easy authority 90 minutes ago, now looking like a man watching his own company's judgment be assessed in real time and found wanting. "I'd be honored," she said. She shook Brenner's hand. The investors left 20 minutes later, Brenner pausing at the door to shake Vanessa's hand a second time, a gesture that was not lost on anyone remaining in the room, least of all Richard. When the conference room had emptied of everyone but Richard, his assistant, and Vanessa, the silence took on a different quality. Richard sat down heavily in his chair. He looked, for the first time since Vanessa had walked in with the coffee cart, genuinely tired. The particular exhaustion of a man whose certainty about himself had taken a series of direct hits in the span of 2 hours and had not yet figured out how to stand back up. "I owe you an apology," he said. Vanessa said nothing. Waited. "What I did," he continued, "handing you that contract in front of investors, I did it to make a joke, at your expense. I didn't think about what that would actually mean for you. I didn't think about you at all. Honestly, beyond the fact that you were standing there and I needed a laugh." He looked up at her. "That's not an excuse," he said. "I know that. I'm just telling you what happened, because I think you deserve the truth more than you deserve a version I've cleaned up to make myself feel better." Vanessa studied him for a long moment. "That's the first honest thing you've said to me in 2 years, Mr. Aldridge," she said. Including the 2 years before this morning when you never said anything to me at all. The words landed without heat, without performance, just the truth, delivered the same way she had delivered the translation. Clearly, completely, without flinching from what it cost to say it. Richard absorbed it. "You're right," he said quietly. "Can I ask you something?" Vanessa said. "Anything." "In 2 years," she said, "did you ever wonder anything about me? Not today. Before today, did you ever wonder what I did before I started cleaning your floors? Whether I had a family? Whether I had a degree sitting in a frame somewhere that I'd worked myself half to death to earn?" Richard was quiet for a long moment. "No," he admitted. "I didn't." "Why not?" He thought about it, really thought about it, with the same careful attention he had once reserved for balance sheets and quarterly projections, and had apparently never once extended to the people who kept his offices running. "Because it was easier not to," he said finally. "If I thought about who you actually were, I'd have to think about 100 other people in this building the same way. And I built a life that runs efficiently by not doing that. By treating people like categories instead of individuals. It's faster. It's simpler." "It's also wrong," Vanessa said. "Yes," Richard said. "I'm seeing that now. 2 hours too late, but I'm seeing it." He stood, walked to the window, looked out at Lake Michigan, the same view he had been looking at for 22 years without, perhaps, ever really seeing it the way Vanessa had taught herself to see language, fully, completely, with attention paid to every layer of what was actually there. "I'd like to offer you a position," he said, turning back to her. "A real one. Director of International Communications. You'd oversee translation and localization for every international deal this company makes. Full salary, benefits, the title reflecting the actual work. Not the work I assumed you were capable of." Vanessa looked at him. "And the consulting role with Brenner Industrial?" she asked. "You keep that too," Richard said. "I'm not in a position to compete with what Klaus Brenner is offering you, and frankly, after today, I don't think I've earned the right to ask you to choose." Vanessa was quiet for a long moment. She thought about her mother. 3 miles south, recovering, the flexible hours that had let Vanessa be present for every difficult morning of the last 2 years. She thought about the framed degree in her apartment. She thought about 2 years of gray uniforms and dusters and being handed cleaning supplies instead of conversations, and how close she had come this morning to simply pouring the coffee and walking back out without saying a single word about who she really was. "I'll take the position," she said. "On one condition." "Name it," Richard said. "My mother's care comes first," Vanessa said. "Always. If she needs me, I leave. No questions, no penalty, no making me feel like I have to choose between this job and her." "Done," Richard said without hesitation. "Whatever flexibility you need, you have it." 3 weeks later, Vanessa sat at the head of a different conference table, not as someone serving coffee, but as the person leading the review. The renegotiated contract with Brenner Industrial Group sat in front of her, corrected, balanced. The arbitrator clause now split evenly between both parties, the currency error fixed, the liability terms revised to reflect what both sides had actually agreed to, rather than what one team's underprepared lawyers had quietly hoped no one would notice. Klaus Brenner sat across from her, his counsel beside him, and Richard Aldridge at the far end of the table. Present, attentive, and noticeably quieter than he had been in the meeting 3 weeks ago. "Section 11, Vanessa said, opening the revised document. "Arbitrator selection. Let's walk through the changes." The room settled into the work. Her mother, when Vanessa told her what had happened, the contract, the humiliation that had turned into something else entirely, the job offer, the framed degree finally hung somewhere it could be seen, had cried at the kitchen table for a long time before she found words. 5 years, her mother said finally. 5 years you carried that degree like it was something to apologize for. "I never apologized for it," Vanessa said. "No," her mother agreed. "You just put it away. There's a difference, baby. But it's a smaller difference than you think." Vanessa had thought about that for a long time afterward. Her mother was right, the way her mother was usually right about the things that mattered most. Richard Aldridge changed in the months that followed. Not completely, not in the dramatic, instantaneous way that made for a tidy story, but in the slower, more honest way that real change actually happens. He began asking questions of people he had spent 22 years not asking questions of. He implemented a review of every department's staffing, not to find more Vanessas, exactly, but to stop assuming there weren't any. He never fully became a different man, but he became, in the specific and meaningful ways that mattered, a better one. And every time he sat in that 42nd floor conference room, the one with the view of Lake Michigan that he had looked at for 22 years without truly seeing, he remembered the morning a woman in a gray uniform had picked up a contract he handed her as a joke and shown him, methodically and without raising her voice once, exactly how much he had been failing to see. Vanessa Price kept the framed degree on the wall of her new office. Summa cum laude. Translation Studies. University of Illinois at Chicago. It had waited 5 years for someone to finally ask. She made sure, from that point forward, that she never waited that long again. Not because she needed anyone's permission to be who she already was, but because she had learned something important in that conference room that she carried with her into every room afterward. The world does not always ask. Sometimes you have to set down the duster yourself, pick up the page, and show them anyway. If this story moved you, if you've ever been underestimated, looked through, or treated like a category instead of a person, share this video right now. Drop a comment and tell me, what would you have done in Vanessa's place? And if you're not subscribed yet, do it now. Because every week we tell the stories of the people the world forgot to look at properly. And sometimes, all it takes is one moment, one page, one chance for the whole room to finally see. Because here's the truth about competence. It does not announce itself in a uniform. It does not require permission to exist. It simply waits, sometimes for years, sometimes far longer than it should have to. For one moment, one page, one person willing to finally ask the right question. Vanessa Price had been ready for 5 years. It just took a billionaire's cheap joke in front of the wrong room to finally find out.